statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, for the record, we'd like to state our principled rejection of the approach adopted by the French presidency despite our objections, including inviting to this meeting delegations under Rule 37 and Rule 39. Their number, including Ukraine, is 6: EU, Italy, Poland, Estonia, Germany, and Ukraine. Also, Denmark, Greece, and Romania will be providing written comments. This is far too many delegations for a briefing, in contrast to an open debate. Aside from this, all of the aforementioned states, with the exception of Ukraine, are members of the EU. In addition, we have the EU delegation here as well. As we've stated on numerous occasions, there is no added value from these additional statements in the Security Council. These are carbon copies of the same assertions adopted by the EU and NATO. The only aim of these delegations in the Council is to rattle off these statements for domestic consumption for the cameras, and we believe this undermines the credibility of the Security Council. We regret the fact that the French presidency is doing this, although it claims to painstakingly observe the rules of procedure of the Security Council. President, it's an open secret that today's meeting was convened by Western colleagues as a box-ticking exercise so that they cynically can execute their monthly Security Council plan on Ukraine so that they can yet again rattle off those same anti-Russian propaganda assertions, at the same time proclaiming their commitment to international humanitarian law, theatrically lamenting loss of civilian lives. And yet not all ordinary civilians are granted this kind of compassion, even of the hypocritical kind. The West impassively distinguishes between important civilians, whose lives being lost can be used to sling mud at geopolitical opponents, distinguishing between them and so-called unimportant civilians, whose lives are deemed collateral damage. At times, they're practically called just victims. This is a staggeringly cynical approach. At its core, it's purely colonial, and we've seen it many times in Africa, in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, peace-loving Gazans, Syrians, Libyans, Iraqis, Afghanis, not to mention Russian and Ukrainians, and nothing more than faceless statistics in a tally of lives lost. On the 30th of December, the regime in Kiev, egged on by British and American consultants, shelled using cluster munitions and multiple rocket launches residential neighborhoods in the Russian city of Belgorod. The main strike hit a Christmas market where there were children and their parents present. As a result, 25 people perished, including 5 children. Over 100 were injured. There were no military objects nearby. That's what Kiev was aiming for. This was a planned war crime meant to strike horror into the hearts of Russians. And yet we didn't hear any words of condolence from our Western colleagues, not one. On the contrary, some of them justified this attack. This is what the Minister of Foreign Affairs of France did. France holds the presidency in the Security Council. They said that Kiev's terrorist attack on Belgorod is an exercise of Ukraine's right to self-defense under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. It's regrettable that French diplomacy, much like Anglo-Saxon diplomacy, has sunk so low. Do you understand that this means that you bear responsibility for these war crimes? Targeted attacks on residential neighborhoods of the Russian cities of Donetsk, Belgorod, and Kursk are ongoing. What did Russia say in response? The president of the Russian Federation, President Putin, stated that Russia will not strike areas where mothers stroll with prams. He said that Russia will use high-precision weapons to target areas where decisions are taken, where there's a concentration of servicemen, of mercenaries, and other similar centers on military sites. End of quote. Russia is striking and will continue striking Ukrainian military targets and civilian and military infrastructure, which underpin Kiev's military capacity. What's very telling is Czechia's behavior. It sought to dodge responsibility for its participation in the Belgorod strike through ammunition supplies, too scared to show up to the meeting of the Security Council on the 30th of December. This is not surprising. After all, it's much harder to stand up responsibly for deaths of civilians before the international community than hiding behind other NATO members. International organizations are behaving no better than civilized democracies. They're shamefully silent, these international organizations, when we're talking about the need to condemn Kiev's flagrant crimes. We haven't heard any clear responses, save for some general remarks in response to the Belgorod terrorist attacks from the Secretariat, given that it's biased. Against this backdrop, what looks particularly cynical and hypocritical is Kiev's so-called peace formula and another meeting that's going to be held in Davos. We'd like to underscore that this pseudo-peacekeeping initiative amounts to setting Russia an ultimatum. And any discussion of the conflict without our participation is bound to fail. We know this. On our part, we're always ready to partake in negotiations, but cannot accept the language of ultimatums. We demand that the UN Secretariat should recall that it must act in keeping with Article 100 of the UN Charter. Mr. President, Ukraine's counteroffensive has failed. This has been recognized by the ruling elites in Ukraine and by the Western political establishment. Ukrainian servicemen left on the front lines have stated this clearly. They've stated in interviews that Ukrainian politicians are trying to demonstrate to the West some progress, any progress at all. And to do this, they're throwing ordinary soldiers to the wolves like hunks of meat, and they're bearing heavy losses. The monstrous cynicism of the backers of the Kiev regime can be seen in the fact that in order to meet their cherished goal, that is ensuring Russia's strategic defeat, to achieve this, they're prepared to justify any crimes and annihilate countless numbers of Ukrainian soldiers. This is deplorable. They don't care about civilian losses either. In the last days, the head of European diplomacy, Josep Borrell, and the Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs said it's necessary to broaden military assistance to Kiev and supply long-range missiles. The U.S. administration is fighting to continue providing military assistance to Kiev. They're battling it out with the Congress and with their own people, ordinary Americans. Yet it's been cynically stated that the Ukrainian armed forces are choosing their own targets. Americans and Europeans should know that these weapons are being used to hit Christmas markets, residential buildings, women, the elderly, and children. Today, Western members of the Security Council repeated the fact that the Russian military is using missiles from the DPRK in its special military operation in Ukraine. This information came from the U.S. John Kirby, an official representative of the White House, stated this a few days ago. And in fact, a representative of the Ukrainian armed forces, the Air Force specifically, said that Kiev did not have any evidence of this fact. So the U.S. seems to be spreading information that is wrong without going through the trouble of checking this beforehand. Mr. President, turning now to the humanitarian situation. We cannot but mention the efforts France and Ecuador have undertaken to remain in the formal role of pen holders on Ukrainian humanitarian issues in the Security Council. There's reason to believe that against the backdrop of an escalation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where attempts are being made to wipe the entire population of the Gaza Strip off the face of the earth, with the U.S. providing cover, against this backdrop, there's reason to believe that today's meeting should lend moral succor to the regime in Kiev, as Kiev's growing problems on the front line are steadily fading into the background. We yet again heard mantras from Western delegations about the grave humanitarian situation in Ukraine, about problems with power as temperatures drop. And indeed, Ukraine has fallen on hard times, and we generally feel for our brother people, the Ukrainians, who are having to suffer many deprivations. These deprivations are due to the actions of their sellout leadership, which is prepared to sacrifice Ukraine's national interests and the lives of ordinary Ukrainians in order to follow directives from their Western sponsors. The West's support is the only reason the junta in Kiev remains in power. And the junta fell for generous but empty promises given by their transatlantic friends. As a result, the junta has led Ukraine into economic and political collapse, turning it into a failed state, the political system of which increasingly bears clear hallmarks of totalitarianism. The Ukrainian military, since the conflict in Donbass began in 2014, has launched attacks targeting specifically critical civilian infrastructure, specifically those providing water and heating. Moreover, medical and educational facilities are being destroyed. Over the course of 8 years in the Donbass republics, at least 50,000 civilian infrastructural sites have been destroyed or damaged. Since 2022, over 16,000 residential buildings and almost 3,500 civilian infrastructure objects, including 700 educational and over 180 medical facilities, 1,000 electrical, water, heat, and gas supply facilities have been damaged or destroyed. But these figures never make it into UN reports because the UN Secretariat is biased. Today, we heard a lot said about solidarity with Ukraine, which Western sponsors are supposedly prepared to continue supporting. And yet it would appear that ongoing support long ago became a way of subjugating the Ukrainian economy and, as a consequence, Ukraine's population. Ukraine's external debt grew to $132 billion in 2022. That's 89% of its GDP. Staggering amounts being given to Ukraine by the IMF, the EU, and Washington are pushing the country into a debt trap for decades to come. There is a company who wants to turn a profit in Ukraine, the US financial company BlackRock. And in fact, Kiev signed an agreement with BlackRock, launching a Ukrainian development fund. Under the guise of attracting private investment to the Ukrainian economy, what we're seeing is a transfer of state sovereignty to external corporate control by the world's largest investment fund. And it's worth noting that over the last decade, the number of the amount of arable land that was transferred to American agribusiness companies exceeded 4 million hectares. We hope that Ukrainians have at last understood that over the last 2 years they've been but a pawn in the confrontation between the West and Russia. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for